Well, good morning, One Church. I always want to say it's so good to see you, but I obviously can't see you, but that changes next week. If you tuned in right in the beginning of the live stream, Liz mentioned that next week, July 19th, we can begin to gather again at both campuses, Akron and Medina. So I'm going to encourage you to stick around to the end of the service. Liz is going to give you a few more details of what we're going to need from you, what it's going to look like. Just to give you a heads up, the services for Akron, we're going to do 8:30 and 10 o'clock in the morning. And then in Medina, it's going to be 10 o'clock. Right now in Medina, there's the whole worship team there, all the volunteers, they are there preparing the building, making sure everything is clean and safe, and also making sure everything still works, because it's been a few months since that building has been used, but that begins next week. And like I said, things are going to be a little bit different for a little while, and I think we all know that. If you've gone to restaurants, if you've gone to stores, things just are a little different for the time being. I wasn't sure what that was going to feel like as a church, so I actually went to another church last week, a church that has already opened and is implementing some of the same things that we are doing. And I'll be honest, in the beginning, it was a little strange, but once we were all in the sanctuary and the worship music started, I forgot I was wearing a mask. I forgot about maybe the awkwardness in the foyer. It was just so good to be worshiping with other people. It was good to be worshiping with other believers after months of doing that on our own, and many of you've been doing it in your living room, on your deck. It was so refreshing to do it with other people, and I just can't wait to do it with what I consider to be my spiritual family. So again, Liz is going to give you some information on how to register. The registration opens right after this service today. So you can register for this coming Sunday at either of our campuses, either of the three services. Again, our kids programs are going to stay online for the time being, but we will have an opportunity to worship together. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Brian. I'm one of the pastors here at One Church, and just to give you a little background on my life, because this will help set the stage for the message today. My wife and I, we have a 13-month-old daughter. Her name is Eliana. Here's a picture of her. She's just the cutest baby on the planet. This was for her 1-year birthday. We did like the cake smash, where you buy a nice cake and then don't even eat it because you're smashing it. But that is our daughter, Eliana. And one of the things that started to happen once I had a daughter is I started to watch cartoons and movies and Disney shows that I didn't think I would ever watch. And not only did I watch them, but I watched them over and over and over. I'm pretty sure in our household, we have watched the movie Moana about 35 times over the last couple months. That is by far her favorite movie, but a close second would be the two Frozen movies. Frozen 1, Frozen 2, I'm sure you have all seen them by now. They're just amazing movies. And what I really like about these movies, especially now with a daughter, is it kind of has a different take on the whole love story. It's not a prince that saves the princess with true love's first kiss. It focuses on the relationship between sisters, and I just love the message of that movie. And honestly, I love the soundtracks as well. They are kind of annoying, and you hear the same songs over and over enough, and it gets a little much, but I'll admit the soundtracks are actually really, really good. If you haven't had a chance yet to watch the docuseries or the documentary on Disney Plus of how they made Frozen 2, it is just unbelievable the amount of detail and work that went into making that movie, and even just the writing process of the song. It was really eye-opening. And one of the more famous songs from the second movie is the song Into the Unknown. Into the Unknown. Now, we talked about this as a staff and a volunteer team. I'm not going to sing this song, but if we get 50 shares of this video, maybe I'll sing it at the end. So Liz is going to let us know if we got 50 shares, and I'll sing part of Into the Unknown at the end of the service today. But it's a great song. It's way less annoying than from the first movie, Let It Go. It's just less annoying. And Clark Spencer, he's the president of Disney Animation Studios. He described this song this way. He says the meaning of this song is that Elsa, the character who sings it, she's headed towards something without really knowing what that something is. She's headed towards something, and she doesn't know what that something is. In this movie, she is stepping out in faith. She faces a lot of change and a lot of potential change in this movie. And I don't know about you, but that's how our world feels right now. Our world feels like we are headed towards something. We just don't know what that something is. It feels like we are headed into the unknown. I mean, if you think about it, our lives have always been pretty unpredictable, but our way of life for the average person is actually relatively predictable. We know when the holidays are. We have routines. We know when the school year starts. We know when our vacation is, stuff like that. Our way of life is pretty predictable. But 2020 has proven to be anything but predictable. We have no idea what next week will look like, what next month, next year. Even as we plan to reopen our buildings next week, everything is still kind of penciled in because we just don't know what's going to happen. Things have been changing, and they've been changing fast. We are living in one of the most unpredictable times of our lives. We are headed into the unknown. Many of us, our careers are completely up in the air right now. There's a lot of people who've been laid off, and you don't know if it's permanent or temporary. Some of us, we might have the same job, but now we're working from home, and everything looks completely different. Many of us are facing financial instability, and you've had to relook at your budget and things that you used to spend money on. You've now had to reconsider how you're doing that. Some of us, we feel called to something completely different. I was talking to someone the other week who decided to retire at the end of this month. He's been at the age where he can retire for a while now, and he still wanted to work a couple more years just to build up the retirement amount. But he's been working for decades, 60 hours a week, and this quarantine time, this time in his life where he's been forced to stay home, it's kind of opened his eyes to things that he's been missing out on, things he's been missing out with his grandkids, and he decided, I'm going to retire at the end of this month. He's ready for the next chapter in life. And there's some of us who we will just do anything we can to get back to where life was in March. We're afraid of what the next chapter looks like. We just are fearful of the future, and we want to go back to how things were. See, in some way or another, we are all walking into the unknown. And as I was thinking of this idea, it reminded me of the story of the Israelites in the Old Testament. When the Israelites were leaving Egypt in the book of Exodus, in many ways, they were walking into the unknown. So let me set the stage for the story we're going to look at today and give you a little bit of context. The Israelites, at this point in history, they had been in slavery in Egypt for over 300 years. So for several generations, all they knew was Egypt, and all they knew was slavery. It's estimated that there were over 1 million Israelites at this time. That's how big their population has got. And then after years in slavery, along comes Moses, who God called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Now, you might be familiar with this story. This is the story where Moses goes to Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh refuses, so God sends a plague over all of Egypt. And then he changes his mind again, and it just goes back and forth. And 10 plagues hit the land of Egypt until finally Pharaoh agrees to let the Israelites go. And Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They make their way out of Egypt towards the promised land. They were headed into the unknown. They were headed for major change in how their life was. So a few lessons that we can learn about change from the story of the Israelites. The first one is this, is that change is not always easier, but it can lead to something better. It's not always easier, but it can lead to something better. So the people of Israel, they've left Egypt and they're headed to the promised land, and God directs them to the shore of the Red Sea. And suddenly at this point, Pharaoh it occurs to him, like, what on earth did I do? We lost all of our slaves. So he sends the Egyptian army after the Israelites to bring them back to Egypt. And this is where it picks up. Exodus chapter 14. It says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us just serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. See, this act of leaving Egypt was more difficult. It was riskier than staying where they were. The easiest thing for the Israelites would be to stay where they were in Egypt. Even though they were in slavery, it still seemed like that was the easier decision. Especially in a moment like this where it felt like their lives may be coming to an end. Slavery in Egypt was looking pretty good. But we know this. Freedom is always better. Look, it continues and says this. It says, Moses answered the people. He said, do not be afraid. Stand firm. You will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And God came through for them. You probably are familiar with this story where Moses, he parts the Red Sea. The entire nation of Israel passes by on dry land. And as soon as the Egyptians pursue across the Red Sea, the waters come back and it takes out the Egyptians. God came through for the Israelites. Change is not always easier, but it can lead to something better. So let's talk about the changes some of us are facing today. Some of us, maybe even many of us, our one-year plan has been turned completely upside down. Maybe this year you had plans of traveling. You were going to start a new career. You were going to graduate high school and walk a stage and have all these graduation parties. And now it just all seemed to go away. Many of us, our 5-year, our 10-year plans have been turned upside down with career changes and budget changes. And maybe you've even had to move during this time. Maybe your job hasn't changed, but now you're not going to an office. You're working from home while also trying to homeschool your kids, which you never signed up for. Maybe your entire budget is changing. I learned this lesson at a leadership conference a few years ago, and it's this, that there is no growth without change. There's no change without loss, no loss without grief, and no grief without pain. Meaning, while we're in the midst of change, it is very likely we will feel loss, grief, or pain. And a lot of us right now, we are feeling some of those things. Maybe we're feeling all three of those things as we walk into the unknown, unsure of what the future is going to look like. There are things that are painful. There are things that we're grieving and we miss. There's things that we just feel like we will never get back again. But on the other side of it, we can also experience growth. So it's July, and one of the things I do in the summer is I golf a lot. So I'm going to use a golfing metaphor today. I've been golfing since I was probably 10, 11, or 12 years old. I don't remember when I began. But for years, I just always golfed. I golfed in high school, I golfed in college, I golfed in my 20s, and now in my 30s. It's still my favorite hobby of all time. And for years, I would consistently shoot in the mid-90s, maybe low 90s on a good day, which in Western New York, that is a pretty average score. Like, you're not a good golfer by any means, but if you can shoot in the 90s, you can shoot decent courses, and you're not like so slow that you're holding other groups behind. But again, no one would ever consider you a good golfer if you're in the mid-90s. It's not until you're in the 80s and the really good golfers are in the 70s that you might be considered a good golfer, or at least for Western New York. So I was pretty content in the mid to low 90s for a while, but eventually I just wanted to get better. I wanted to improve my score, so Danielle, my wife, she bought me golf lessons for my birthday a few years ago. And I remember I went to the golf lesson, and my instructor, he changed everything about my swing. He changed how I was holding the club. I used to hold it like a baseball bat with all 10 fingers on the club. He taught me to interlace these 2 fingers. He changed how I stood over the ball before my shot. He changed my backswing, my follow-through. He changed the speed of my swing. He changed everything about my swing, and never had golf felt more uncomfortable in my life. It just felt like I was learning how to golf all over again. And the first couple rounds after that first lesson, my score actually went up, which in golf is a really bad thing. You want your score to go down over time, not up. And my score started to go up, and I came back to my instructor, and I told him, I'm like, I just don't know if this is working for me. The easier thing for me to do at that point would have been to go back to my old swing, to start swinging the golf club like I used to swing the golf club. But my instructor, he encouraged me to stick with it. To stick with it, he said, make it muscle memory, and eventually you will improve. And for probably about 5 to 10 rounds of golf, my score was not better, but then things started to click. I started to get more consistent and more comfortable, and it started to become muscle memory. And the next year, I remember my average score actually dropped 2 strokes, which isn't a huge deal, but that's a pretty decent improvement over 1 year. And now 2 or 3 years later, my average, not only am I playing harder golf courses, but my average score has dropped about 8 strokes since my lesson. See, it was 1 step backwards and 2 steps forward. But during that 1 step backwards, it was very easy to just stop what I was doing and just go back to the old way. But I stuck with it, and eventually I was able to take those 2 steps forward. See, those of us who have been forced into some sort of change during these last few months of the pandemic, here's my encouragement to you. View this as an opportunity. How can you make this 1 step backwards but 2 steps forward? And by the way, a step backwards in one category may mean 2 steps forward in another one. It's not just that it will be in our career, 1 step backwards, 2. It could be maybe a step backwards for our career, but 2 steps forward for our family. It could be 1 step backwards for our budget, but 2 steps forward for our physical or our spiritual health. See, a step backwards in one area can give us the margin and the time and the focus to take 2 steps forward in another. When we feel loss, grief, or pain, there is always an opportunity for growth. Change is not always easier, but it can lead to something better. The second lesson is this, is that change will stretch our faith. Change will stretch our faith. So the Israelites, they continue their journey, and they end up in the desert. It's about 2 weeks after crossing the Red Sea, and the Israelites begin to complain again. You'll see that this is a theme for the Israelites, especially throughout the Old Testament, but especially here in Exodus. It says, in the desert, the whole community of Israel, they grumbled against Moses and Aaron, the 2 that were leading them. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. So first of all, you would think that after God parts a body of water to let 1 million people walk through, that they would have had a little bit more trust that maybe God could provide for them. But, again, it was only 2 weeks ago. But it's so easy to forget how God came through for us in the past when we're faced with the new struggle. So God told Moses that every day he would rain down bread from heaven for them in the morning. So he would provide manna for them in the morning, and then he would provide meat for them in the evening. And he gave them these really clear instructions to just gather enough food for that specific day. And then on the sixth day, they could gather 2 days' worth of food. He was teaching them the Sabbath through this. But look at this, Exodus 16, verse 19 and 20. It says, Then Moses said to them, to the Israelites, no one is to keep any of it until the morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. I think a lot of us would probably do the same thing. We would look at our family and want to stock up on some of the manna and the meat, but God, miraculously made the meat not last throughout the night because he was teaching them to trust God. See, I think some of us probably needed this lesson a few months ago when we were all stocking up on toilet paper. I mean, can you imagine if God taught us this lesson a few months ago, if just miraculously just enough double ply showed up in our bathrooms to get us through that day, but we couldn't stock up? I mean, we would have faith to move mountains. But seriously, God was providing food for them without a safety net. Because where there is a safety net in our life, there's very little need for faith. Had God given them a year's supply of food or even a week's supply of food, there would have been very little need to trust God and to rely on God on a day-to-day basis. And here's the problem with our world, and especially in a country like America, is we love our safety nets. We love our savings accounts and our insurance policies and retirements and our steady paycheck every 2 weeks. And by the way, those are good things. We should want those things. Those are wise things to have in place. But some of us lost some of those safety nets over the last few months. Some of us, we lost our medical insurance or our steady paychecks. And we've lost some of these safety nets. And when our safety nets disappear, it either reveals the strength or the weakness of our faith. And here's the lesson. When we're faced with a difficult change, this is an opportunity to grow and to stretch our faith. When I look back at the times when my faith grew the most, it was never on the mountaintops. Mountaintops are great. It's great to look back at the things that God has done for us, to just take those moments to enjoy life. But my faith doesn't grow on the mountaintops. My faith grows in the valleys. It grows in the struggle where our spiritual muscles are stretched. We have a chance to grow in times like that. And simply from my own experience, I've come out on the other side of situations like that, the other side of valleys, with a stronger and a more tangible faith. So the 3 lessons: 1, change is not always easier, but it can lead to something better. Second one, change will stretch our faith. And then third, God was teaching the Israelites that he will come through regardless of the circumstance. He will come through regardless of the circumstance. So let's talk about one more miracle today. They leave Egypt, the Israelites, they cross the Red Sea, and now they're in a desert. Exodus 17, verse 3 says this, but the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. Again, this is a common theme in the Old Testament. They said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? So Moses goes to God on their behalf, and God says this to him. He says, I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. And again, God came through for the Israelites. God provided water from a rock. But think about this for a moment. When the Egyptians were pursuing the Israelites and they get to the Red Sea, the people needed land, but all they had was water. Now they're in the desert and the people needed water, but all they had was land. It's completely different circumstances. In fact, they're complete opposite circumstances, but God still came through for them. God still provided for them. In fact, every circumstance the Israelites faced, God provided for them. And he came through in bizarre ways. If you read the Old Testament, it was clear that God was not interested in providing for them in ordinary methods. He was way more interested in providing in extraordinary methods, in ways that the people could only say that was because of God that this happened. They couldn't give credit to anyone but God because of the extraordinary ways that God came through. And I don't know what your world looks like right now, but I want to encourage you that we serve a God of miracles. We serve a God that comes through for us. We serve a God who is good and faithful and worthy. But just like the Israelites, when we're facing a new challenge and a new valley, it can be very difficult to remember the valley that God had brought us through in the past. So I encourage you to remember the ways and remember the things that God has done for you throughout your life. When all the Israelites had was a lake, he provided for them land. When all they had was a desert, he provided water. And we're all facing some changes in our way of life right now. I believe that it can lead to something better. It could be one step backwards in one area and 2 steps forward in another. I encourage you to allow it to stretch your faith and to believe that God will continue to provide for you. And as we as a church walk into the unknown, my prayer is that we would come out on the other side of this better than where we were in March. That our faith would be stronger, that our faith would be more tangible. I believe that through this valley that we're facing, that we can come out on the other side better because of it. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for all the ways that you've come through for me and my family throughout the years. God, I ask that you would continually remind me of those things. And as I'm facing new trials in the future, God, that you would just remind me of the miraculous things that you've done for me and your people in the past. I pray that throughout these valleys in our life, God, that you would stretch our faith and challenge our faith. God, that we can grow because of it. And I just pray that as we begin to gather again next week, that you would just be with us as a church, whether we're here in person or online. God, that you would continually strengthen our faith. God, we pray this in Jesus' name.